Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show for rational thinking people, where we examine important issues either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show this week, we're going to look at thinking in principles to increase your health span. So, to start off with, thinking in principles, a key feature of the rational approach is always to think and act according to principles. But more than that, to do so consciously of the principles upon which we're acting and thinking. Because in reality, you can't escape following principles. All you can do is not be conscious of the ones that you're actually following. So, for example, if you were to follow a principle of always being honest in your life, if you're unaware of that, if you just don't even think about it, and sometimes you're honest and sometimes you're not, well then by default you're following a principle of sometimes being honest and sometimes not, or the principle of not worrying too much about how honest you are. So it's all about being conscious of the principles and specifically choosing them. And the reason for principles, whether we consider them and use them to guide our thinking and action in our life in general, or with respect to health, is that they make things much easier. They remove the need to have to make a decision in every single concrete example that we face. So if we're making decisions about our eating habits, for example, we don't have to start again facing every plateful of food in front of us or every contemplated meal from scratch, like a newborn baby with no knowledge. We can simply apply the principle, and it's much easier and quicker to make a decision. So on top of that, the rational approach, the rational man or woman, prioritizes health. And that's why on my website and in this podcast, we focus on health. Because in order to have a successful life experience, in order to enjoy our lives, ultimately, we must have a fully functional vehicle in which to experience our life. We need a fully functional mental capability, and we need a fully functional body in order to maximize our enjoyment of life, which is what we're all about. That's the main purpose. So the main or the easiest way to work on optimizing our health is, as I mentioned, through the use of principles, and that's what we're going to look at today. Now, your diet is arguably your most powerful tool in affecting your health. And so today we're going to be considering principles, or we're going to be looking at principles that we can use to guide our dietary choices. But it's important to note from the outset that if we come up with a principle, say, for example, to avoid sugar, which is one of the ones we'll look at, it doesn't mean that the rest of your life, you're setting out on a journey where the rest of your life is devoid of the pleasure of sugar. It doesn't mean that. If we live according to a principle to guide us, we can always have indulgence days. We can plan a strategy to shift our habits over a period of time. We don't need to dive into the deep end of hardcore practice. And it's important for us to acknowledge this, because food addictions are challenging and changing habits in general is rather challenging. So we have to maybe start off with changing, following principles maybe through the weekday, but perhaps allow us to have the weekends off. If, for example, at the moment you can't live without pizza, then you could avoid it during the week and tighten up your dietary habits, if you like, during the week, and allow yourself a weekend's respite. Now, I don't recommend doing this for long, but it's a great way to start. You can then shrink that and perhaps allow an indulgence period once a month or every so often beyond that. So the point is that it's not all about sackcloth and ashes. It's not all about misery and denial. We're trying to develop self-control and self-discipline, because these ultimately reap enormous benefits in a personal sense of achievement and empowerment, and therefore a sense of self-esteem. And this ultimately is a significant contributor towards our overall happiness. So the first principle I want to discuss is an overall guiding principle, if you like, and it's to think long term. Now, it's fairly self-evident that if we plan long term, we can expect better results than if we just live by the seat of our pants, if you like, in the moment. And for example, if we plan our financial security and well-being from our late teens on through our life, if we have a strategy of wealth accumulation, we're far more likely to achieve success of financial independence as we get older by this act of thinking long term. And this doesn't mean that you might not become very rich without doing so, but the point is that it increases our chances of achieving success. So thinking long term is a fundamental principle for rational thinking people. So this means that we have to plan for a healthy old age now. We have to think about and discern strategies in our lifestyle choices today which will result in our health tomorrow, and therefore increase our health span, the number of years that we can enjoy full functionality of mind and body. Our health tomorrow is determined by the choices we make today. So this sort of feeds into a second principle, which is not to eat specifically for taste all the time, or rather not to eat solely for taste all of the time. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to forego the pleasure of delicious food. Eating is one of life's greatest pleasures, but it means that we have to factor taste in also with avoiding toxicity and eating for nutrition. So we mustn't be guided just by taste. We have to broaden our considerations if we are to achieve this idea of planning for the long term. This is the key principle. We must keep thinking long range, 10, 20, 30 years into the future. If you want to avoid the experience of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, you need to do something about it today and tomorrow and the next day. We need to do something about it now in order to enjoy a positive and enjoyable, beneficial long-term result. So the third principle that we're going to consider is achieving and maintaining metabolic flexibility. Now, you may know what I mean by that, but for anybody that doesn't, we'll just do a quick tangent to discuss that. So why should we be concerned about metabolic flexibility? Indeed, what is it? Well, let's look at what it is and the fact that it has enormous benefits over the long term. Metabolic flexibility is essentially the ability of our bodies to burn either sugar in the form of glycogen or fats in the form of ketones. The body is fundamentally able to run on these two distinctive types of fuel. And the problem of modern day living is that most people, our habits of eating, what we eat and how often and frequently we eat, tends to result in the fact that we are always burning sugar, and our bodies are not well adapted, not well accustomed to burning fat or these ketones as fuel. Now, this is largely a result of the fact that when we ingest foods that contain sugar, when we eat sugar, it tends to be burned preferentially. And we have to consider the role of insulin here very briefly. So we'll just talk very briefly about this as a quick tangent. When we eat sugar, and blood sugar rises quite quickly when we do so, depending how absorbable it is. If it's something like apple juice or something readily absorbable, your blood sugar level can rise high quite quickly. And consequentially, our insulin levels rise quite quickly. And the hormone insulin tells our bodies to burn sugar and also to store fat. So the consumption of dietary sugar always tends to switch our bodies over into a sugar burning mode. And it shuts down fat burning and encourages the store of fats. And this is basically a sort of we've inherited this, if you like, from our ancestors as an evolutionary adaptation for good times in the summer when the fruits are all on the trees and the harvest is being reaped. And it tells the body that this is a good time to consume lots, store fat. It's not the winter time. It's time for growth and making hay while the sun shines, you could say. And consequently, our ancestors may have gone through or if in northern latitudes particularly, would have gone through a lean time in the winter where the harvest obviously is consumed. There's something that all vegetable growers will know of as the hungry gap, late winter, early spring, where you've consumed everything. And then our ancestors would have probably naturally shifted into a fat burning mode when the sugary foods have been consumed. So these days, of course, with refrigerators and 24-hour convenience, we've lost that. So we needed to try and recreate the metabolic flexibility of being able to burn fats by the use of a deliberate eating strategy. And the point is that this is enormously beneficial to do so. Conversely, when we're eating sugar all the time, we can develop a resistance to insulin, this hormone that triggers our storage of fat and many other things. We can develop insulin resistance, which of course is the beginning of the disease we call diabetes, type 2 diabetes specifically. And this leads on to a range of other modern chronic diseases. So it's very, very worth our while looking into this achievement of metabolic flexibility. So let's just have a brief look at some of the benefits of this metabolic flexibility. Firstly, and most broadly, is the achievement of a far higher degree of health. You can more or less avoid all sorts of illness, what used to be referred to as the common colds and flus and things before this alleged global illness situation. You can avoid these things almost all the time. And I haven't had a cold or flu or anything like that for many years now, 5, 6, 7 years. So this is due to a number of factors. Very briefly, at a chronically high level of blood sugar means that various proteins in the blood can get glycated. They can bind with glycogen in the blood, and it forms these advanced glycated end products or AGEs. And this can cause problems in the circulatory system. We've also got the fact that as we eat sugar regularly, and when our body is triggered to store this sugar away in the form of fats, it forms triglycerides. And high levels of triglycerides in the blood can cause all sorts of problems as well, not least with the cardiovascular system. When we're burning sugar for our energy all the time, it's a dirtier burn as well. There are more free radicals, more reactive oxygen species produced through burning sugar than there are through burning ketones, which are, as I said, a result of fats. So if you imagine, a car or a bus driving along with that smoky black exhaust out the back, this is the metabolic equivalent of our bodies burning sugar when compared to burning fats. The second major advantage is mental clarity. Our brains are about 60% fat, and it serves us very much to have a higher healthy fat content in the diet. And many people, when they adapt into a fat burning metabolic state, report a sort of lifting of brain fog. This is a very common experience. I experienced it as well. And you get a very obvious increase in mental clarity. So it may seem counterintuitive, but when we consider our evolutionary past, if our ancestors were getting hungry, if they needed to go out hunting again, if the mere fact of hunger and ceasing to burn sugar meant that we lost mental acuity and thinking ability, thinking clarity, that would simply be a downhill slope all the way to death. But it doesn't work like that. It actually works in reverse. And as our bodies start to burn fat, we gain mental acuity, and our mind tends to clear. The mental fog lifts, and this sharpens our minds up and would in fact have assisted our ancestors in their hunting or gathering needs. Yes, the brain does need a small amount of glycogen to function, and this fact is often misrepresented in the mainstream as saying, no, the brain must have sugar. But this is not true, because the brain can synthesize the glycogen that it needs on demand. So in fact, you don't need any dietary sugar in order for your brain to function and your body to generate the small amounts of glycogen that it does require for its optimal function. So another key advantage to this metabolic flexibility is actually having more energy. ATP is more efficiently generated by burning ketones than it is by burning sugars. And you can liken this to, if you were sitting in your home next to a real fire, or if you're out next to a campfire, if you're feeding that fire with paper and kindling all the time, yes, you get a bright burn, but you're continually feeding the fire very often. Whereas if you imagine feeding that fire with logs, then they burn hotter and much longer. And burning fat is the equivalent of burning logs on a fire, as opposed to squirting liquid fuel on it, or paper, or kindling, which is the metabolic equivalent of burning sugar. So you get more energy and more sustained energy. You get a cleaner burn, and you also get effectively long-range fuel tanks. So our energetic levels and ability to go longer between meals is greatly enhanced by this metabolic flexibility. Another really important benefit is improved gut health. As we consume a fair amount of sugar, or a lot of sugar, we tend the profile of the gut bacteria in the small and large intestine, primarily the large intestine, tends to adapt to our diet. So if we eat a sugary diet, that will promote the proliferation of sugar-loving bacteria, whereas if our diet is shifted towards being metabolically flexible and burning fats, that encourages a different set of bacteria. And in fact, as we reduce our sugar consumption, our overall diversity of the kinds of microbes populating the gut actually broadens, which is another significant health advantage. Obviously, dental health is another great advantage. When we reduce sugar, we naturally get a benefit there from less tooth decay. And lastly, although there are more benefits, we could go on, but lastly here, I just want to mention effortless weight loss. When we have metabolic flexibility and we are able to burn fat as a primary fuel for periods of time, this results in the body effortlessly finding its own natural weight. Of course, the increased blood sugar level, it would be signaling the body through increased insulin levels to continuously store fat. So whenever we're eating sugar, again, we are storing fat. And this is why we really must change diet to lose weight. You can't just do cardiovascular exercise or any exercise as a sole strategy to weight loss. So as soon as we gain this metabolic flexibility and we're burning fats, we can eat to satiety. We can eat as much as you like. Your hunger mechanism starts to work more accurately, and you're not operating on a food craving level where you're just suffering a sugar crash and need to eat sugar again. So the net result of this metabolic flexibility is virtually effortless weight loss. So there are a huge number of advantages to achieving metabolic flexibility. The ability for your body to burn fats in the form of ketones, as well as sugar in the form of glycogen. And it must be said, just as a last point on this subject, that it's a good idea to cycle between the two. So burning fat, generally we're in what's termed nutritional ketosis, and then every once a week or once a fortnight, if you increase your sugar consumption, you have a nice roast dinner with roast potatoes and, maybe a nice sweet and so forth afterwards. This can cycle us out of ketosis, and it's good for the body to cycle in and out of the two rather than staying on one of them all the time. So the next, some of the following principles speak into this idea of metabolic flexibility. So the fourth principle that I want to mention here is eat to reduce your sugar consumption as a general guiding principle. So this means, in practicality, cutting out those unnecessary snacks of, having biscuits with your cup of tea, indeed having sugar in your tea and coffee. This is a very good habit to try and change. Possibly one of the most powerful ones that you can do is to shift your hot drink habit away from sugar if you do currently have sugar in those drinks. So removing the tea and the sweetness in the drinks, the biscuits and the pastries and the sweets in general, these snacks which are generally just catering for a sugar crash, they're not a good idea at all. Avoiding fizzy drinks, sugary drinks, or drinks with high fructose corn syrup in, all of these sorts of things is also a key part of this strategy, as is avoiding processed foods. So if we are buying these sort of ready meal packaged things that don't really require any kitchen work, they usually have reduced fat content, and they're almost all of them have extra sugar. So it's very, very good idea to steer away from any habit of processed foods in general. Any calorific deficit as we reduce sugar should ideally be made up with healthy fats. And, whether that's avocados, coconut oil, or healthy animal fats, eggs, organ meats, liver, butter, cheese, all these sorts of things, very healthy substitutes that can steer us towards this state of nutritional ketosis and achieve metabolic flexibility, this other guiding principle. So the fifth principle I want to look at is to avoid processed wheat products. Now, this again feeds into metabolic flexibility, and it essentially means majorly reducing your bread consumption Things like pastries, donuts, cakes, naan breads, wraps, poppadoms, all of these sorts of things, breakfast cereals, all of these wheat-based products, because wheat it begins to be digested by the saliva in your mouth, by the amylase in there, and it's broken down into sugar almost by the time it gets to your stomach. So all of these wheat products are essentially dietary sugar. And the big problem with wheat, of course, modern wheat, is that it's grown and processed. It's grown particularly and harvested using high amounts of glyphosate, and glyphosate will take a serious negative toll on your gut health. Glyphosate tends to perforate the gut lining, and where the gut lining should maintain a tight integrity, and the lining of the gut should open and close specifically to allow nutrients in and to allow toxicity to be expelled, dumped overboard into the gut. And glyphosate compromises all of this, causing what we call leaky gut. So this is a massive second reason to avoid wheat. If we consume or we opt for organic wheat, this is slightly less harmful, but it doesn't address the dietary sugar requirement, although it might mean that the wheat has less glyphosate in it. The next principle is to eat organic as a overall guiding principle once again, because toxicity in the body, largely coming, or to a high degree coming into the body through the diet, is a very significant factor that affects our health negatively. So we really must reduce our toxic exposure. And of course we should be doing this in all areas of our lifestyle choices. We should try to reduce our exposure to any form of toxicity, whether it be the paint we choose to paint our front room, or the chemicals in our sofa and our carpets, our personal care products. We should be aware of the concept of avoiding toxicity everywhere. But specifically with regards to our dietary choices, this means eating organic as exclusively as you can. And this won't mean that you've reduced or you've eliminated all the toxicity, but it will mean that you've reduced it. It's a question of doing what you can. And there are other ways that you can reduce dietary toxicity even further, but the point here is that if you eat according to the guiding principle of purchasing organic food, this will significantly help you in your overall avoidance of toxicity strategy. So the last principle I want to look at is the idea of restricting your eating time window. And this is called intermittent fasting. And it can be achieved quite easily by either skipping dinner or skipping breakfast. And we're just literally reducing the amount of time in the day that we are consuming food. And no doubt you're aware that our current culture tends to be a snack all day, or all the hours that you're awake virtually kind of strategy. It's very easy to get into this, but it's counterproductive to your health. As we restrict our eating window, we are sort of preparing our body and better predisposing it, if you like, towards this metabolic flexibility. And it can be a very, very useful lead-in towards the achievement of nutritional ketosis. It can very much help the body adapt in towards this fat-burning state. Because notably, it doesn't mean you need to restrict the amount you eat. You can effectively gorge yourself for the amount of time that you allow. And you can vary this window as well. You can shrink it slowly over time, so you don't need to jump into the deep end again. But at the far end of this extreme, there are those who advocate eating only once a day. I'm not one of those. But I do sometimes restrict my eating window down to as little as 4 or 5 hours. And you can eat as much as you like within that window. And if that was the only thing you do, that would significantly predispose your body towards easier adaptation into nutritional ketosis and the burning of fat, this metabolic flexibility. For if you did that for, say, a month or two before going full into nutritional ketosis, you'd find it much, much easier. Also, if you are interested in practicing extended fasts, this is a very, very good way to start. It can make it much easier when you come along to do a 1, 2, 3, or even 5 or 10-day fast. Very much easier to achieve if your body is accustomed to this intermittent fasting or reduced eating window. So if we follow these key principles, you'll not have to make specific decisions at every mealtime. And it's very, very much easier to use principles to guide our choices in this respect. You don't have to meet every concrete example of any meal or any meal idea anew, if you like. Just follow the principles and it simplifies everything. It makes the decision making easier, you could say. So I hope you've got some value from this podcast and these guiding principles. They've certainly helped me achieve a far greater degree of health in my life. If you feel you got some value, please do make a comment or raise questions. I'm always happy to enter into dialogue. If you're watching this on a visual platform, please hit the like button and also add a comment. Also, please check out the website. There's loads more there on thinking in principles, thinking skills in general, how to find truth, what is truth, and a good deal on health and how to be healthy. So do visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. And I hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.